The Nativity, the story of Jesus' birth and childhood, is regarded by millions of Christians around the world as the heart of the Christmas season. For them, the true meaning of Christmas is a celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem. Even the modern Anno Domini dating system is based on early approximations of the year Jesus was born. The story involves well-known features such as the journey of Jesus' parents to Bethlehem, Jesus being born in a stable because there was no room at the inn, the angel proclaiming Jesus' birth to lowly shepherds, and the Star of Bethlehem guiding the wise men thousands of miles to bring Jesus gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It's a long cherished story in church tradition, but is it historical? Was Jesus really born in a stable in Bethlehem? Were Mary and Joseph visited by shepherds and wise men from the east? In this video, we will evaluate the historical plausibility of the Nativity, diving into the evidence that challenges the details of Jesus' birth found in the gospel narratives. Then we will discuss the true origins of the infancy narratives in order to figure out whether they come from reliable eyewitness testimony or from the literary and ideological goals of the gospel authors. Back in 2018, when I first started MythVision, I was grinding from my desk, sitting down night and day in, day out. It never stopped. Between late nights and long hours, I was really indulging in everything, eating all sorts of stuff, going to the Dollar Tree, eating snacks, and eating really, really good meals. And it was a blast. I enjoyed it, but then reality sank in. Like a lot of you that are out there, I started putting on weight. I started noticing my energy levels depleting and wasn't as satisfied with what I saw in the mirror. I started dabbling with intermediate fasting and really increased my workout because when you're sitting all day, you really need to exercise, and also started experimenting with how many carbs I'm intaking. The problem was how long it takes to try and figure out whether or not you're on the right track and whether or not you're going to see results. That's why I'm beyond excited to introduce you to today's sponsor, Lumen. Lumen is a revolutionary device that measures your metabolism through a simple breath. It gives you a real-time insight to whether your body is burning fat or burning carbs. If you're burning fat, that's great. You're on track with your health and weight loss goals, you're crushing it. If you're burning carbs, no problem. Lumen gives you personalized goals and options to help you get back into the fat burning mode. So diet, exercise, it gives you these ideas and helps you to achieve that goal simply through your breath. It's smart, it's simple, it's been truly life-changing for me. So if you want to take that next step into improving your health and your life, go to lumen.me/mythvision to get 15% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/mythvision to get 15% off your purchase. Big shout out to Lumen for sponsoring this video and helping me get my health back in track, and not just me, but countless others, all simply through a breath. I really appreciate you sponsoring this video. Before we get into the evidence and arguments concerning the reliability of the Nativity story, it is important that we recognize the fact that there isn't just one Nativity story. In fact, there are several. Within the canonical Gospels, there are two different narratives about Jesus' birth and childhood found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Outside of the canonical Gospels, there are even more Nativity stories, like the one found in the 2nd century Gospel of James. For this video, we will be limiting our discussion to the accounts found in Matthew and Luke. Contrary to what most Christians assume, these two narratives that describe the circumstances of Jesus' birth do not tell the same story. For example, neither Matthew nor Luke describes both the wise men and the shepherds visiting Jesus in Bethlehem. In Matthew, there are wise men, but no shepherds. And in Luke, there are shepherds, but no wise men. So right off the bat, we can see that the popular nativity scenes that depict shepherds, magi, and angels huddled around Jesus in a manger can be thrown out. This does not fit either of the Gospels. The accounts in Matthew and Luke also do not agree with each other. To demonstrate this, all we have to do is read each infancy narrative by itself and then place them side by side. Let's start with Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem. After Joseph is betrothed to Mary, an angel tells him in a dream that Mary has become pregnant with the Son of God. Mary gives birth to a son, and they name him Jesus. Some time passes, possibly up to 2 years, and the family is still living in Bethlehem. A group of foreign astrologers from the East, popularly known as the Magi, or wise men, travel to Judea, following a star that they believe marks the birth of the Messiah. They briefly visit King Herod in Jerusalem and inform him about the star and the birth of the Messiah. Herod sends the Magi to Bethlehem to find the child, secretly planning to murder him. The Magi visit the family and present Jesus with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But they do not return to King Herod and instead go straight back to their own country. Herod is furious and orders his soldiers to slaughter all the male babies and toddlers in Bethlehem. But an angel warns Joseph ahead of time, so the family flees to Egypt before the massacre. They remain in Egypt until the death of Herod, and then head back to Israel. However, when Joseph learns that Herod's son, Archelaus, is just as bad as his father, he brings his family up north to Galilee, away from Archelaus, and they wind up settling in the obscure village of Nazareth. Now let's look at the version of the Nativity in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. They only go to Bethlehem temporarily to register for a census. Mary gives birth to Jesus in a stable or cave for animals because there's no room at the inn. There is no star and no magi in Luke's account. Instead, the family are visited by a group of shepherds who were informed about Jesus' birth by an angel. 8 days after Jesus is born, Mary and Joseph have him circumcised, and after another 33 days, they go to Jerusalem for the purification ritual stipulated in Leviticus 12:4. After they completed everything required by the law of Moses concerning newborn children, about 41 to 42 days, the text says they return home to Nazareth. There's no mention of any trip to Egypt, and not so much as a hint of any danger in Judea. It should be clear already that these are two completely incompatible stories. Virtually every detail of the Nativity is different between Matthew and Luke. The only points of agreement being the names of Jesus' parents, Mary being a virgin, Jesus being born in Bethlehem, and the family moving to Nazareth at some point. That's it. Now, Christian apologists are quick to point out that different does not necessarily mean contradictory. This is true to some extent. For example, shepherds and magi could have both visited Jesus, with each gospel author only choosing to mention one or the other. After all, Luke does not specifically state that no magi from the East ever visited Jesus, so technically it's not a contradiction, even if it does seem very strange that Luke would have left out such an extraordinary detail. This kind of explanation may work for some of the differences, but not all of them. There are a few discrepant details between Matthew and Luke that are genuinely incompatible and contradictory. We can illustrate this by simply looking at the ways people have tried to harmonize them and pointing out how these attempts utterly fail. The typical nativity harmonization put forward by Christian apologists goes something like this. Mary and Joseph originally live in Nazareth, as Luke clearly indicates, and they travel to Bethlehem to register for a census. Mary gives birth in a stable because there's no room at the inn. And shepherds come to visit the baby,
After 8 days, they have Jesus circumcised, and after 33 days, they go to the temple for the purification rite. A year or two later, the Magi arrive in Jerusalem following the star. They tell King Herod about the birth of the Messiah, and then visit Jesus as a toddler in Bethlehem. After that, Herod orders the massacre of the children in Bethlehem. The family flees to Egypt, and finally they end up back in Nazareth. The end. Does this seem like a pretty solid harmonization? Most Christians think so. Unfortunately, there are quite a few problems with it if you examine the text closely. First of all, there is the question of Mary and Joseph's hometown. Were they originally from Nazareth, or did they move to Nazareth to escape the Herods? The harmonization we looked at takes Luke for granted, but ignores key information in Matthew. Matthew 2:11 states that the wise men find Jesus at a house in Bethlehem. The family is not living in a stable, a cave, or an inn. They actually have a house in Bethlehem. Moreover, look at Matthew 2:21-23. Quote, "And he rose and took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in the city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene." End quote. When they find out Herod has died and they can come home, where do they intend to go at first? Back to Nazareth, their hometown? No, back to Judea. And why does Matthew say they ended up in Nazareth? Not because that's where they were from, but because they wanted to get away from Archelaus, and because Matthew claimed Jesus, being a Nazarene, was supposed to fulfill a prophecy. The renowned scholar Raymond E. Brown, who wrote an entire book on the infancy narratives of Jesus, elaborates on this point. Quote, "Joseph's first thought was to return to Judea, meaning to Bethlehem of Judea, because he and Mary lived in a house there. Since Joseph and Mary were citizens of Bethlehem, Matthew takes pains to explain why they went to Nazareth." End quote. Next problem, the harmonization, takes Matthew for granted concerning the length of the family stay in Bethlehem, but ignores key information from Luke. Matthew implies the family stayed in Bethlehem for quite a while, since the text says Herod ordered the massacre of children 2 years old or under. However, based on the info given in Luke, the family only stayed in Bethlehem 41 or 42 days after the birth of Jesus, and then they went straight back to Nazareth. As Luke 2:39 plainly states, quote, "And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, that is, the circumcision and purification, they returned into Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth." It is not possible to square this with Matthew's narrative. There's no room to fit a journey to Egypt and return to Israel after the death of Herod within this verse.
No serious exegete would interpret, "When they had performed everything, they returned to their own town of Nazareth," as including a massive detour to another country. In his textbook on the New Testament, Professor Bart Ehrman writes,
"As you might realize, the family's direct return north in Luke does not seem to allow time for Matthew's wise men to visit them in their home in Bethlehem a year or so later, or for their subsequent flight to Egypt." Again, Raymond Brown agrees. A second difficulty is that Luke tells us that the family returned peaceably to Nazareth after the birth at Bethlehem. This is irreconcilable with Matthew's implication that the child was almost 2 years old when the family fled from Bethlehem to Egypt, and even older when the family came back from Egypt and moved to Nazareth. We cannot fit this trip to Egypt in the 41 to 42 day period either. There's no indication of any danger or threat from a maniacal king while Mary and Joseph are completing the purification rites. They make no attempts to hide the child, and there is no hint of stress or haste, or even the slightest concern about performing rituals for a newborn male less than a quarter-mile from Herod's palace. Given all of these irreconcilable discrepancies and issues between Matthew and Luke, we can safely conclude that the two narratives are contradictory, which means that they cannot be both 100% true and accurate. If everything in Luke's nativity is accurate, then at least part of Matthew's account has to be wrong, and vice versa. In another textbook on the New Testament, Yale professor Del Martin explains, if one carefully compares the birth narratives presented by Matthew and Luke, one finds that it is next to impossible to harmonize them in any historically respectable way. The different accounts can be harmonized only by gymnastics not permitted to reputable modern historians. That is fine because the New Testament need not be regarded as a history book, but using it as a resource for constructing a historical account of early Christianity necessitates reading it critically, not naively. Next, we will examine the information of both accounts from a historical standpoint to see whether the external evidence supports either of them being true. A good place to start is probably the Star of Bethlehem, mentioned only in the Gospel of Matthew. This star is very important to Matthew's nativity because it brings the Magi to Judea, and it even leads them to an exact location where they can find Jesus. Matthew 2:9 states that after the Magi visit King Herod, behold, the star that they have seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. The Star of Bethlehem can apparently move west to east in the sky, spontaneously change direction, and hover over a location like a drone. Modern people, of course, know that stars can't move like that, but an ancient first-century writer like Matthew didn't know any better. The prevailing cosmology at the time viewed stars as small objects attached to the dome of the sky, meaning the firmament. They didn't know that stars are actually much larger than the Earth, located trillions of miles away, and that their apparent motion across the sky is actually due to the rotation of the Earth. Other astronomical objects like planets or comets also cannot spontaneously change direction or stop moving right above a particular house. Although we can't really blame Matthew for his scientific ignorance, we can still dismiss his description of the Star of Bethlehem as a scientific impossibility. As Raymond Brown states, a star that rose in the east, peered over Jerusalem, turned south to Bethlehem, and then came to rest over a house would have constituted a celestial phenomenon unparalleled in astronomical history. Yet it received no notice in the records of the time. If the Star of Bethlehem never existed, then the visit of the Magi must also be fictional, along with all the events that resulted from this visit: Herod's massacre of children and the flight to Egypt. Another problem scholars have noticed with Matthew's account is the claim that the Magi visited Jesus and decided not to return to Herod to prevent the king from discovering where Jesus was. If wealthy foreigners visited Bethlehem, you can bet the entire town would know about it, and the king himself would have no trouble figuring out which house they went to. In The Birth of the Messiah, Raymond Brown lists several implausible and unrealistic details in Matthew's narrative, including the visit of the Magi to Herod. The suspicious Herod makes no attempt to follow the Magi in their 5-mile journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. One can imagine the impression that exotic Magi from the east with royal gifts would make in a small village. Yet when they go away, Herod's intelligence system cannot discover which child they visited. The next problem with Matthew's narrative concerns the massacre of male children under the age of 2. Like the Star of Bethlehem, extra-biblical attestation of this event is completely lacking, even though such evidence would be strongly expected for something so horrifying and traumatic. When Christian apologists hear this objection, their typical response is to complain, "This is just an argument from silence." absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. That's true, in most cases. However, instances where evidence is strongly expected override this rule. Take Flavius Josephus, for example. In his 20-volume work, Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus spends 4 entire books detailing every aspect of Herod's career from the start of his reign to his death. We would strongly expect such a thorough account to mention a massacre like the one described in Matthew. Steve Mason, a historian who specializes on the writings of Josephus, clarifies, "It is strange, though, that Josephus does not mention any slaughter of male children near Bethlehem, right at the end of Herod's reign where his account is most detailed. Such a monstrous action could hardly have escaped public notice. Josephus would arguably not have mentioned it in war, even if he had known about it, because that work holds Herod up as a fine example of good Jewish-Roman relations. But in Antiquities, as we have seen, the gloves come off, and Josephus goes into all sorts of grisly details about the king's rule in order to explain the unparalleled suffering that eventually killed him. In this context, in which he dwells on much less dramatic infractions of the law, it would plainly have served his purpose to mention a massacre of infants. That would have been Herod's basest action. In response to this, many apologists have argued that the massacre was not known to Josephus because it was, in fact, extremely small. If the population of Bethlehem was about 1,000 people, they reason, and male children 2 and under made up about 2% of the population due to high infant mortality rate, then no more than 20 children would have been killed by Herod. Once again, these Christian apologists fail to account for all the information in the text. Matthew doesn't say Herod only killed male children in Bethlehem. It says Herod killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region. Matthew 2:16. So what does all that region entail? Well, it probably included Jerusalem, since that's where Herod's palace was, and Matthew 2:18 implies that it included Ramah. Since Ramah is 11 miles away from Bethlehem, the towns of Bethany and Ein Karim likely fall within the radius. Most of these towns probably had a similar population to Bethlehem, but Jerusalem's population was at least 20,000. This would make the total death toll of male children in all that region around 500, not just 20. Moving on to Luke's account, this one is just as fraught with errors as Matthew's, despite the popular claim that Luke was a first-rate historian with impeccable sources and investigative skills. For such a high-caliber historian, one would think getting something as basic as the year of Jesus' birth should be no problem. Yet even here, Luke shows pretty major confusion. Luke 1:5 dates Mary's conception by the Holy Spirit to the days of Herod, king of Judea. And in Luke 2:2 he says Mary was pregnant during the time Quirinus was governor of Syria. It is impossible for both statements to be accurate. Herod's reign ended with his death in 4 BCE, and Quirinus' governorship didn't begin until 6 CE. This would be like claiming someone was born during the presidency of George W. Bush and in the first year Donald Trump was elected. Utterly incoherent. David S. Potter, a renowned expert on the Roman Empire and on ancient Roman history in general, writes, "This controversy stems from Luke's statement that the birth of Christ took place while Quirinus was governor of Syria and Herod the Great was on the throne of Judea. The other evidence for Quirinus' career, some inscriptions from Syria, Tacitus' Annals, Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, and Strabo's Geography, reveal that Luke's statement must be incorrect. Herod died in 4 BC, but Quirinus was governor of Syria in AD 6 or 7. Many Christian apologists try to resolve this by redating Herod's death, or by proposing an earlier governorship for Quirinus. Unfortunately, such desperate attempts to move the dates forward or backward a few years are unlikely to eliminate this 10-year discrepancy. Some apologists try to play around with the wording of Luke 2:2 by reinterpreting this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, as this registration was before the census which Quirinius, governor of Syria, made, postulating some unknown earlier census before the one in 6 CE. Unfortunately, there's a big problem with all these suggestions. When we look at the historical context of Judea between 4 BCE and 6 CE, it is clear that the Roman census conducted in Judea during the reign of Herod would have been impossible. Prior to 4 BCE, both Judea and most of Galilee were under the control of Herod the Great. After Herod's death, the territory was divided into 4 kingdoms. Galilee was under Herod Antipas, and Judea was under Archelaus. Archelaus proved to be an incompetent ruler, so the Roman emperor deposed him and converted Judea into a Roman province in 6 CE, appointing Quirinius as governor. This was precisely the reason why there was a census in 6 CE. Incorporating Judea into the Roman Empire meant that the Romans now had to collect taxes from the people directly, rather than relying on a Jewish client king. It makes absolutely no sense to say there was a Roman census in a region that was not even a Roman province yet, or that Quirinius conducted a census before he was made governor. The census of Quirinius could only happen after King Herod died, after his son Archelaus was deposed, after Judea was annexed by Rome, and after Quirinius was made governor over the region. Steve Mason writes, further, it is not clear how there could have been a census of Judea under Herod's rule, since the territory was not yet subject to direct Roman taxation. According to Josephus, it was the removal of Herod's family that brought about the need for a census and direct Roman rule. This point is also supported by Raymond Brown. Indeed, even if, without evidence, one does posit this earlier governorship of Quirinius, how does one explain a Roman census of Palestine during the reign of Herod the Great, a client king who paid tribute to Rome? Herod had his own taxes and tax collectors, and there's no evidence that the Romans collected taxes based on a census within his realm.
The known census of Quirinius in AD 6 or 7
was conducted precisely because Herod's son Archelaus had been deposed, and Judea was now coming under direct Roman government and taxation. Not only that, Galilee was still under Herod Antipas all the way until 39 CE. So if Mary and Joseph were originally from Nazareth, as Luke tells us, Quirinius' census would have not applied to them.
As the renowned New Testament scholar E.P. Sanders states,
we know from Josephus, supported by an ancient inscription, that in the year 6 CE, when Quirinius was legate, Rome did take a census of people who lived in Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, not Galilee, and not by asking them all to travel. Luke's Mary and Joseph, who lived in Galilee, would not have been affected by Quirinius' census, which covered only people who lived in the 2 Roman provinces, Judea and Syria. Galilee was independent and not a Roman province. So far, Luke, the first-rate historian, is off to a very bad start. But it gets even worse. While the census of Quirinius was a real historical event, the way it's depicted in Luke is completely insane. Luke imagines Augustus sending out a decree requiring everyone in the Roman Empire to leave their homes and journey to the land of their distant ancestors to register. This is not just inaccurate, it is a historical absurdity. The utter impracticality of such a decree and the amount of chaos it would cause is very well explained by Bart Ehrman. We also have no record of a worldwide census under Augustus, or under any emperor at any time. Moreover, a census in which everyone was to return to their ancestral home would have been more than a bureaucratic nightmare. It would have been well nigh impossible. In Luke, Joseph is said to return to Bethlehem because his ancestor David came from there. But David lived 1,000 years before Joseph. Can it be possible that everyone in the empire was to return to the place their ancestors lived 1,000 years earlier? If such a census was required in our day, where would you go? Imagine the massive migrations involved. Then imagine that no other ancient author considered it important enough to mention, even in passing. Again, Steve Mason agrees. Yet such an event, as described by Luke, would have caused massive upheaval, with each person returning to his or her ancestral home. This would mean that all the Jews of the diaspora, nearly 1 million in Egypt, and tens of thousands in all the major cities of the empire, would have had to return to Judea. In the very mobile Roman Empire, virtually everyone would have been in transit somewhere. So how did the Romans, who were well known for their efficiency, actually conduct censuses? Instead of having the citizens journey far away from home to register, they simply had everyone register in their own towns. Raymond Brown writes, "Would a Roman census have sent people back to their tribal or ancestral homes to be enrolled, as Luke describes in the case of Joseph? We have no clear parallel for such a practice. Since enrollment was primarily for taxation purposes, the general Roman pattern was to register people where they lived or in the nearby principal city of a district, the city from which the tax would be collected." Steve Mason agrees. According to Roman law, one was taxed on the basis of one's possessions, especially land and produce. Therefore, it made no practical sense to have people return to their ancestral homelands, much less their ancestors' villages, where their possessions could not be verified. We have no record anywhere of such a displacement of people. Finally, the renowned John Dominic Crossan concludes, "The idea of everyone going back to their ancestral homes for registration and then returning to their present homes would have been then, as now, a bureaucratic nightmare. What was important then, as now, was to get you registered where you could be taxed. It is a little sad to have to say because it has always been such a captivating story. But the journey to and from Nazareth for census and tax registration is a pure fiction, a creation of Luke's own imagination, providing a way of getting Jesus' parents to Bethlehem for his birth." In response, apologists often appeal to Papyrus 904, which contains a census edict from Gaius Vibius Maximus, the prefect of Egypt around 104 CE. They claim that the requirement for citizens to travel in order to register supports the account in Luke. However, it's clear just by reading the edict that no one is being required to journey away from home to the land of their ancestors. The text reads, "The census by household having begun, it is essential that all those who are away from their homes be summoned to return to their own hearths, so that they may perform the customary business of registration and apply themselves to the cultivation which concerns them." The prefect here is ordering people who are away from their homes to return for registration, not the other way around. Based on this regulation, if Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth, they would be required to stay there. They would only have to leave Nazareth if Nazareth was not their home, as Raymond Brown explains. A papyrus describes a census in Egypt in 8104, wherein a temporary dweller, in order to be enrolled, had to go back to the area of his regular domicile, where he had a house. Obviously, this ruling was motivated by tax considerations about property and agriculture, and it offers little support for sending Joseph from Nazareth, where he permanently resided, to Bethlehem, where clearly he had no property or wealth, according to 2:7. So far, we've discussed irreconcilable contradictions between the Nativity story in Matthew and Luke. We've discussed implausible and impossible details in both narratives, and we've discussed historical blunders both gospel authors made. In the last part of our video, we will look at the mythical birth and infancy stories of other ancient figures which have striking similarities to the stories in Matthew and Luke, and were used by the gospel writers when creating the Nativity stories. The first and most obvious example is Moses, the famous lawgiver who supposedly delivered the Israelites out of Egypt and led them to the Promised Land. The infancy narrative of Moses, in which Moses' parents narrowly rescue him from the maniacal Egyptian king massacring Hebrew babies, was clearly the inspiration of Matthew's account of King Herod massacring Jewish babies in Bethlehem. As Maurice Casey explains, the story will have been sparked off in someone's imagination by the story of Pharaoh ordering the deaths of all male Hebrew babies, with the escape of Moses in Egypt. This story gives Matthew a reason for his account of the flight of the family into Egypt, which is also unmentioned by Luke. Matthew legitimates it with Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son." This enables Matthew to get the family to Nazareth, where Luke correctly believed they had previously been living. The Matthean story is a tale based on scripture from beginning to end. E.P. Sanders agrees with this conclusion. Matthew probably derived this information from the story in Exodus 1:21, according to which Moses, when an infant, was threatened by a similar order from the Egyptian Pharaoh. Matthew saw Jesus as a second, superior Moses, as well as son of David, and he casts a good deal of this opening chapters in terms of the stories about Moses. The narrative of the flight into Egypt and the return reminds the reader of the history of Israel and the Exodus from Egypt. Another famous figure with a mythical birth story is Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor who ruled in the 6th century BCE. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote around 430 BCE about how magi predicted the birth of Cyrus to the Median king Astyages. The text reads, "To him was born a daughter whom he named Mandane, and in his sleep it seemed to him that there passed from her so much water as to fill his city, and also to flood the whole of Asia. This dream he delivered over to the Magian interpreters of dreams, and when he heard from them the truth at each point, he became afraid." Like Herod, Astyages attempted to kill the child and thwart the prophecy that his kingdom would be overthrown. But Cyrus was rescued by shepherds and sent to Persia, where he grew up to become the conquering ruler he was destined to be. The prophetic magi trope was also used in the birth legends of Alexander the Great. Alexander, who was also believed to have a divine father, was predicted by magi just like Jesus and Cyrus. In 44 BCE, the Roman statesman Cicero wrote, "Everybody knows that on the same night in which Olympias was delivered of Alexander, the temple of Diana at Ephesus was burned, and that the Magi began to cry out as day was breaking, Asia's deadly curse was born last night." The predictions of Magi was already a popular literary device long before Jesus' birth. Again, Dr. Litwa explains, "In this literature, Magi often appear at the birth of great kings. As well-known diviners, they are best qualified to prophesy the greatness of a future ruler. Herodotus seems to have initiated this literary trend. Decades and even centuries before Jesus, we have stories about magi, shepherds, paranoid kings, and baby massacres. When we get closer to the time the Gospels were written, these examples multiply spectacularly, with story after story about the births of famous kings and sages who were believed to have both divine and human parents, whose births were predicted by magi or heavenly omens, and who narrowly escaped sinister plots to kill them as infants. Augustus, Mithridates, and Apollonius Etiana all have birth stories involving a heavenly omen, like a bolt of lightning or a comet, signaling that a tremendous or even divine figure was just born. For example, a legendary birth narrative written by the Roman historian Justin describes the incredible spectacle that accompanied the birth of Mithridates. The future greatness of this prince, even signs from heaven had foretold, for in the year in which he was born, as well as in that in which he began to reign, a comet blazed forth with such splendor, for 70 successive days on each occasion, that the whole sky seemed to be on fire. It covered a fourth part of the firmament with its train, and obscured the light of the sun with its effulgence, and in rising and setting it took up the space of 4 hours. The account goes on to describe how Mithridates' guardians tried to murder him twice and failed, just like how Herod tried to murder Jesus, and Pharaoh tried to murder Moses, and Astyages tried to murder Cyrus. In an account by another Roman historian, Suetonius, the Roman Senate tried to thwart the birth of a prophesied ruler by issuing a decree which forbid the rearing of any male child for a year. Yet this plan failed to stop the birth of Emperor Augustus. Augustus, along with Plato, Alexander the Great, and many others, had a human mother and a divine father, just like Jesus. This was the trope of all tropes in the ancient world. If a figure seemed extraordinarily wise, powerful, or important, he must have had a divine parent. In some cases, a figure wasn't just the offspring of a god, but the incarnation of that god in human form. The birth narrative of Apollonius of Tyana begins with the god Proteus appearing to Apollonius' mother in a scene strikingly similar to Gabriel's appearance to Mary in the Gospel of Luke. To his mother, just before he was born, there came an apparition of Proteus, who changes his form so much in Homer, in the guise of an Egyptian demon. She was in no way frightened, but asked him what sort of child she would bear, and he answered, "Myself." A god becoming human by impregnating a woman with himself? Sound familiar? At this point, Christians are bound to point out that Jesus is completely different from all these other figures because he was actually born of a virgin. The other gods in these pagan myths all needed to have sex with a human in order to make her pregnant. So the Christian God stands out because he was able to make Mary pregnant without sex. This is almost true. We do have one or two myths about other semi-divine figures born of a human woman and a divine father, but conceived without sex. First, the mythical figure Epaphras was born of the priestess Io, who was made pregnant by Zeus. Knowing Zeus's reputation for having love affairs with mortal women, it may come as a surprise that in this particular myth by the Greek playwright Aeschylus, Zeus merely touches Io with his hand to make her pregnant. In the classic academic book, The Historical Jesus in Context, New Testament scholar Charles H. Talbot writes, "There was, however, another tradition that was averse to thinking of physical sexual contact between deity and humanity. Consequently, a begetting that did not involve physical sexual contact was sought." Aeschylus is an early example. In Suppliants 17 through 19, Io is said to be impregnated by Zeus in the form of the on-breathing of his love. Prometheus 8:48-52 states that at Canabus, near the mouth of the Nile, Io will be restored to her senses by Zeus through the touch of his unterrifying hand. The offspring will be Epaphras, meaning touchborn, named from the touch, Ephapsis, of the hand of Zeus. But wait, it gets even better. In a work by the Greek philosopher Plutarch, written exactly the same time as the Gospel of Luke, the conception of the philosopher Plato by the god Apollo is described in the exact same way as Jesus' conception is explained to Mary by the angel Gabriel. Dr. Litwa discusses this parallel by comparing the Greek terminology used by both Plutarch and Luke. The mechanics of divine conception were relatively simple. No penetration and ejaculation were involved. Only the pumping of divine power, dynamis, and breath, pneuma. The language is close to what one finds in Luke. It is not impossible, Plutarch wrote, for divine breath, pneuma, to approach a woman and engender certain productive principles. Elsewhere, he remarked that it is by a different power, dynamis, that God engendered in matter its productive principle. For the author of Luke, God's breath and power operated to produce Jesus. the angel tells Mary, sacred breath, pneuma, will come upon you, and power, dynamis, of the Most High will overshadow you. Luke 1:35. In this passage, breath, sometimes translated spirit, and power are exactly the terms used by Plutarch. King Solomon was absolutely right when he said, "There's nothing new under the sun." Births predicted by magi, plots to kill newborns, heavenly omens, divine parents, even virgin births, all mythical tropes, recycled and reused over and over again. Nothing from the Nativity story is new and original, much less historically accurate. That concludes today's video. The Nativity stories in Matthew and Luke are pure fiction from beginning to end. Between the contradictions, historical errors, and obvious borrowings from older myths and ancient literary tropes, there's nothing left from the birth and infancy narratives of Jesus that can be regarded as historical. There's no good reason to believe Jesus was actually born in Bethlehem, as the explanations that Matthew and Luke provide contradict each other and are based on historical blunders and outright falsehoods. All the other details of the Nativity story, the Star of Bethlehem, the flight to Egypt, the massacre of the children, and the visit of the magi and shepherds, are equally unhistorical. It may be a good story, and it may bring joy to a lot of people during the Christmas season, but it's not a true story that happened in history. Thank you so much to Stephen Ford for crafting this documentary and helping edit such an awesome production. Please consider checking out our scholarly website, mvp-courses.com, to take a course by some of our well-known academics that have worked here with us on MythVision. You'll own the course for life. You're helping us, you're helping the scholar, you're helping yourself. Like this video, drop a comment and tell us what your favorite part about these narratives and this video was. I'm really interested. And listen, I hope everyone has a wonderful Merry Christmas. And never forget, we are MythVision.